Alright, so now that we got Redux up and running, what we can do is start going through each of these components, starting from the top, and pretty much just making them work. Plugging them into Redux, making all the buttons and everything functional, reading in the right data, so on and so forth. Now, before we actually get to that, I did see that I had one warning in the console, and that is because I forgot to include, let's see, in the history, T head, I need to wrap all these THs in a TR, a table row. And then hopefully that'll get rid of that issue. But now that that little minor issue is taken care of, I'm gonna pop back open Redux and we'll start with these top components up here, like I said. So what I'm gonna do, and I'll show you what the top card is right now. So for each of these top cards, we just hard-coded in the word network for the heading. And then we also hard-coded in the element that we're passing in, which is this spaced items element, which is basically this logo in pencil right here. So I want to update the component now so we can pass in whatever string that we want for a heading. And also, I'm going to have it so we can pass in any node for this bottom content right here, because most of the time it's going to be these spaced items, but whenever we first boot up the app, you see in the manager we don't have any account or any network right now. So whenever we don't have anything selected, I just want to have a button that appears here that says something like select the account or select the network. And then whenever you click that button, the modal is going to pop up, and we still have to build that too. And well, that's going to allow you to actually select whatever you're trying to select. So the first thing I want to do is actually just rewrite some of this top card logic. So let me go ahead and make my interface first. So for the props, I want to export interface. And whenever I'm defining the props for these components, I follow the naming convention of the component name and then props. All right, so we're going to be passing in two props to this component. And by the way, to actually use these props, after SFC, you just need to put the prop type, and that's going to be top card props. But either way, the first thing that we're going to be passing in is a heading, and that's going to be a string. So I'll say heading string. And then to actually use it in your component, we can destructure it right here. And then we'll replace this hard-coded network with whatever we passed in for a heading. And then we want to do the same thing because we're going to pass in one more prop, which we're actually passing in as a child. So children, and let me go ahead and import this. So for the content body right here, well, I have an error right now, but for this right here, we're just going to be passing in either a button or the spaced items. So we need to import from React the element React node. All right, so whenever you use this component, give me a string for the heading, and then give me any React node, and I will display that right in this content section right here. All right, now let me just pretty this up, and with that, we can now test it in this top component. So you see top component is complaining a little bit right now because we're not passing in those props that we just defined. So just to test things out, we'll copy this spaced item, All right, so what we'll do is we'll have the account section on the left. So we'll say for this top card, the heading is going to be equal to account, and this is going to be a button by default, but since we don't have that button written yet, I'm just going to use spaced items and check it out. So this next one is going to be network. So all right, so we are now rendering the spaced items correctly, account and network. And now that we saw that we can pass in a valid React node, what I want to do is go ahead and create that button object so we can actually pop open the modal. So for this, let me actually clean some of this up. All right, I'm gonna pop open my styles file, and I actually wrote this earlier, I think what I'm going to do now is kind of have the CSS pre-written, because I want this tutorial series to be more about like TNBOS and React and Electron. However, I feel like I'm spending a little bit too much time on the CSS. So if there's ever any new concepts that we're going to cover related to style components, I'll make sure to take the time and cover those. However, just for, like basic button styling or div styling or whatever, I'll just have it all pre-written. So anyways, this button right here, just to read through it real quick, it's just going to be a button with basically no background. It's going to be pretty much gray, and it's going to take up the full width of the container. And then I added a little hover state as well. But anyways, that is our button. You'll see it in just a second. Now, what I'm going to do is, like I said, the logic is going to be for this account content right here. If you have an active account, then we're going to display the account information, and it's going to look pretty similar to this. Now, if this is null, which it is right now, then we're going to display the button. Now, I can probably just write this logic right in here, but I like to split it out into a separate function since it has some, I don't know, it's not just like a simple expression. It's going to be a little bit more involved. So I'm going to make a function called render account content. And then the logic is basically, ooh, you know what? Actually, let me just go ahead and return that button right now. So s.button, and I'll say select account, and I'll show you what the button looks like. And then we'll go ahead and add in that logic to say, if you have an account, display this. If you don't, display that, so on and so forth. So for the account content, instead of spaced items, I'm going to be passing in this. And all right, so this is our button. This is what it looks like. And now let me go ahead and add that conditional. And again, that conditional is going to check in Redux to see what the value of this active account number is. So as the next step, we need to figure out how to read in data from Redux into our component. So to do that, we are going to make a new directory in speed test, and I'm going to call it Selectors. And since this selector, or we're actually going to make a few of them, but since these primary selectors are just going to be working with that Redux state, I'll just go ahead and name this state. And I'm going to write all my Redux selectors right in here. And before we write any selectors, what I want to do is I want to import from system types the root state. Actually, let me show you this. So this is basically the root state of our entire store. And I'm not just talking about the speed test chunk that we created, but the entire like TNBOS Redux store. So once we have that, to create a selector, we're just going to make a const. And I will name this get active account number. And this is going to be equal to a function that takes the state, not this state. It's going to take in the state, and just to type it out, the shape of that is going to be root state. And remember, from our typing, if we go to the manager, the valid values for active account number are string or null. So whenever we use this selector, that's the value that we're going to be returning. And now, and as a return value, we just need to say where it is, and that is state.speedtest.manager.active.account.number. And let me actually go ahead and write the other selectors that we're going to need right now, even though we won't be needing them immediately. But in addition to getting the active account number, I also want to get the active network ID. So get active network ID, again, same type, string or null. And instead of plucking off the active account number, we're just going to pluck off the active network ID. And aside from that, we also want to create a selector to get these runs right here. We'll just pluck off and get the entire dict. And because I want to type that out, what I want to do is apps speed test types. We'll just import runs from here. And all right, so we'll say get runs. Now, what was the shape of that? Well, if we check in our runs, just this runs dict and speed test dot runs. All right, so we now have 3 selectors written, one to get the active account number, and then the active network ID, and then the runs from Redux. Now, in order to use these, let me clean up some of this, close tabs to the right. In our component, the first thing that we need to do is we need to import use selector from React Redux. And then once we have that imported, I'm gonna make another, actually, let's just call it the same thing. I'm gonna make a local constant called active account number, and this is gonna be equal to use selector. And what we pass in here is that selector that we just wrote. So get active account number, and again, this file is selector state. So import get active account number from apps speed test selectors state, and then pass this right into your selector. And now in your component, this active account number is always going to be equal to whatever the account number is, or active account number that we have stored in our Redux store. So now that we have that, we can write logic that looks like this. Whenever we are deciding what to render right here, what we can say is if we don't have any active account number, which we don't have right now, it's set to null, then what we want to do is we just want to return this button that says select an account, and it's going to pop open a modal, allows us to select it. Otherwise, what we'll do is we'll rewrite this later on, but for the time being, we're just going to return spaced items by default, since when we have an account selected, that's what it's going to look like. And you see that whenever I updated that, this UI didn't change because, and that is correct, because we do not have this active account number. All right, pretty cool. So now let's go ahead and get started on our modal component. And this modal component is going to be used whenever we click this button, select account, and this button that we can't see yet, but it's going to say select network. And it's going to be similar to the modal I wrote in the chat system, and I'll give you a little preview right here. So we're going to click a button, and then we of course have a pretty standard modal. It has a heading and a close button as kind of the top section, and of course you can close it to close it. Now, in addition to just this div floating in the center of the screen, I also wrote this overlay, which is kind of like dims the background. And it's just another way to close this modal as well. If you click anywhere outside the modal on the overlay, I just thought it was a cool UX. I don't know, kind of intuitive. Click outside the modal, it closes as well. So we're going to be going for that same style. So we'll make it basically like this. We'll have an empty container where we can pass in a heading. And just like that top card, I want to be able to pass in any content right here. So for the account modal, we'll just be passing in a list of account cards. And for the network modal, we'll just be passing in a list of network cards. And I like doing it that way. In general, my philosophy with modals is to keep them as unopinionated as possible. A lot of people have like forms in their modals quite often, and they tie a bunch of form logic in there. But I found that if you try to keep that logic in the child component or the component being passed in, then it just makes everything a lot easier. So I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about right now. Now in components, let me go ahead and remove some of this first. All right, create a new directory called modal, and let me do all my standard stuff. Create an empty template and an empty styles file, and just rename this to modal. Beautiful. Now let's go ahead and define what props we're going to be passing in. So export interface, modal props. And again, to use those right like this. And okay, so for the header, we're going to be passing in a string, and we also need to pass in a close function. And this is going to be returning void. And aside from that, let me see if I can just steal it from my top card. We're also going to be passing in our React node. And let's follow that same pattern and pass in the content as children. So whatever we pass in as children, this is going to be the modal body, more or less. And now let me just go ahead and make sure we're passing everything in. And the header. Okay. Now, instead of just returning a basic HTML element or a component like we have been, what we need to do is we actually need to use a portal. And for those who aren't familiar with portals, I'll show you, actually, let me show you this. All right, so in my main template, this root element right here is where I'm rendering basically the entire React app. Now I also have this element right here called modal root. What we're going to be doing is creating something called a portal, and this is just going to allow us to render some element or really any valid React outside of this DOM hierarchy. So instead of rendering inside root, we're just going to render on modal root, and that's going to allow us to basically have that functionality where we have this entire overlay in modal appearing on top of all these other components. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is import the create portal function from React DOM, and that is called create portal. Now, instead of returning this container, we are instead going to return a portal. And this function is going to take two params. The first one is the React code or elements that we want to render. And the second one is where do we want to render it. Now, for the React code, what I'm going to do is actually use a fragment, because I'm basically going to have something like this. I'm going to have my overlay rendering right here. And then here is where I'm going to render the modal, and that is just going to give us that, you know, black dimmed background with that HTML element appearing on top of it. But anyways, this is the basic structure for the first param of what we want to render. Now the second one, if we see, I'll show you this. So we're going to render it right here, and this is a div with the ID modal root. Now, in order to kind of reference this from React, what we can do is we can say document.getElementById, and again, that was modal root. And another thing that I'm going to put is this, just to make TypeScript happy, this exclamation mark. And this is because, I'll show you the exact error. It says that argument of type HTML element is not assigned to this, basically saying that whenever you create a portal, you have to have an element, and we don't know if this element actually exists on the DOM or not. Now, because I know definitively that it exists because I hard-coded it in myself, and it's not like conditional, it's just always there, that's how I can safely put this exclamation mark to tell TypeScript, yes, it's definitely there. Don't worry about it being null or undefined or anything like that. So now let's go ahead and start styling this thing. And instead of container, I'm going to call it modal. And let me go ahead and add some generic styling off the bat. So we're going to give it like pretty much the same color background as the app itself. And also another thing that I want to do is I want to say that the position is fixed. And the reason for this is because I want to make sure that this is going to be displayed in the very center of the screen. So in order to center this div in the center, what I'm going to do is say left 50%. And I'm also going to say top 50%. Now, what this is going to do if we just render this is it's going to basically make it so the top left corner is in the middle of the screen, but I want the entire container to be in the middle of the screen. So, you know, the center of the div is in the center of the screen. So just to get that logic, what I'm going to do is transform, and I'll translate by -50%, -50%. And this is going to make sure that that entire div right here is perfectly aligned in the center of the screen, good to go. Now, another thing that I want to do is style my icon, because remember we have that X in the heading section on the top right. So just to add some styling to that, I already have this written. Again, this is the same as the pencil icon, where it has a color, and then when you hover over it, then it has just a little change in the background and color, just to give the user an indicator that they are hovering over something. And maybe I will give a cursor pointer to this. So this icon is going to appear in this header section. So actually, let me type the rest of this out. So again, our header is at the top, and on the left-hand side, it's going to have that text, and on the right-hand side, it's going to have that icon. So that's why I made it display flex, justify content space between, and just add some padding so everything isn't bumped up right against the edges. And then under the heading, we're going to have this content section. So anything that we throw in there for children, it's going to have padding as 16. And again, this is just to make sure that those cards don't bump up right against the edge. Looks a little bit better. And let me go ahead and put all this on the screen, and then we'll make our overlay. So again, the parent component for all of that stuff that we just wrote is s.modal. And what I can also do is I'm going to be passing in this class name from styled components right in this modal. And then inside the modal, we're just going to have the header and then the content. So s.header. And I'll just make a span. And inside this span is where we are going to render whatever string we passed in for the header. Now, remember this header right here, it is a flex element. So since we have justify content space between, this header is going to appear to the left, and then whatever we write right here is going to appear to the right. And for that, we want this icon appearing. So s.icon. And I'm also going to need to import that close button. So from mdi.js, that close button icon is actually, what is it? MDI close. There we go. All right. So as a prop, I want to say that the icon is equal to MDI close. And then another thing that we want to do is we want to have this on-click handler be equal to this close functionality that we're going to be passing in. Again, we didn't write this function in the parent component yet, but we will in just a sec. And now this also takes a size prop. So I'll say 16 pixels, see how that looks. And another thing that I want to do is I want to pass in this unfocusable. And this is just for styling issues where if we have it focusable, then like the blue ring appears around it and it looks a little bit weird. So anyways, this is how we have our header structured. Now, the only other thing we have to do for now is say content section, which is just basically the body of the modal. All we need to do for this is say whatever children element that we pass in, we'll render it right in the content, just like that. So this is all good for our modal styling. However, we still need to style that overlay. So let me just steal this. All right, so for that overlay or that black background, I'm just gonna call it overlay. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give it a height of 100 vertical height, which means just take up the entire height of the screen, and same thing for width, except you do 100 VW for vertical width. And then just to make sure everything is positioned correctly, for left, 0, and then for the top, it's also 0. And this just makes sure that the top left corner of this element is in the top left of the screen. And I also am gonna do position fixed. 1 second, got like an eyelash in my eye. Position fixed, there we go. Now, this is gonna work fine for an overlay. However, just to make it a little bit more fancy, instead of whenever we click the button, the modal pops up and it has this dim black background, I want this overlay to kind of fade in. So in order to do that, we can learn a new trick from styled components, and that is a keyframes method. So keyframes, and again, all this is, it's a helper method from styled components that allows us to add keyframes for an animation. So what we can do to use it is do something like this. Create a constant called add overlay and set it equal to keyframes. Now inside the ticks, you pretty much define how you want to transition this animation. So we'll say from, and for the background, we will just do, actually, let's do RGBA 0, 0, 0, 0. So we're going to transition from a completely opaque shade of black to a slightly transparent shade of black because we want to still be able to see the background, what's going on. So we can adjust this opacity if it's too dark or too light later on. Actually, this is supposed to be 2. From 2. Okay. So these are our keyframes. Now, how do we use this as an animation? Well, in our overlay div right here, for the animation property, we can use that $ curly brace syntax and throw in our overlay, which are our keyframes animation right here. And now for this, we still need to define how long we want the animation to take. And we'll say 0.3 seconds. And we also need to define how we want the animation to run, and we'll just say forwards. So this is going to give us our 3-second black fading property. And to actually use this, make sure I got the right thing. So this overlay div is going to appear as a sibling element to modal. So s.overlay. And then we just need to pass in the onClick handler on this as well, because remember, we have 2 different ways to close this modal once it's open. We can either click the close icon or click anywhere on that overlay, and that's going to close it as well. All right, I think all of our modeling style is good to go. So as next steps, now that we have our generic modal, in other words, we just have an element that pops open in the middle of the screen, and we can pass in a heading, and you can click close to close it. What I'm going to do next is create another directory called Modals, because I want to start working on our 2 use cases for that modal, and that is the account modal and network modal. So again, one of these is for whenever you click this button, and that modal is going to pop open with a list of accounts, and the other one with a list of networks. So let me go ahead and make that account modal first. So under modals, what I'll do is create another directory called account modal, and this is just same thing as I always do, component and styles. Let me get this organized. All right, so the account modal, I'm just going to name it to account modal, and then let me go ahead and just define my props as well. Why's my IDE so laggy? You know what's weird? Every time I make an interface for props, my IDE starts to lag. I don't know. It's interesting. Okay, so the props that we're going to be using for the account modal are... Actually, let's just go ahead and use this close functionality, because we're going to need to pass this through to the actual modal right here. However, I don't want to import the modal right in this component because I want to apply some additional styling to it. So instead of just treating it as a normal component, we'll import it as a, we'll pretty much be able to work with it using our styled components. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import, actually I think that's the default. So import u or unstyled modal from, and what location was that? Apps, speed test, components, modal. All right, so now that we have our unstyled modal, we are going to make a styled version of that. And how do we want to update the styling? Well, let's just say that we want to display flex, because remember, in this account modal, we're going to have a list of cards. So we want to just make sure that those all appear in a column. So I'm going to do display flex and then flex direction column. And you can also give it a specific width and height, because I don't believe in our modal styling, yeah, we don't have any explicit width and height right here. So whenever we import it and add our custom styling, we can just add whatever width and height we want depending on our use case. So I'll say a max width for this, and this is probably going to need to be tweaked later, but I'll say 400 and a min width of, I don't know, 360, 380, whatever. All right, so we have our modal styled for our use case, and then to use it, we can just do this s.modal. Now, of course, we need to pass in the class name. Also this close function, which we didn't write yet, but we're also going to be passing this through to modal. And then this modal is going to take a header property as well. And for the header, we can actually just hard code this in. So select account. And I'm getting a typing issue because I forgot to define my preps right here. And all right. Now, another thing that I want to kind of point out, and this is kind of a tricky bug, but I figured I'd show you that if you ever forget to export this interface, then whenever you try to import it and using your styled components, you may see this error right here. It says exported variable modal, pretty much just something like this. And it's kind of difficult to understand this error. So even though we didn't come across this, I just wanted to point it out because it's something that, well, I used to do quite commonly. So, you know, maybe save you some headache. And anyways, for this account modal, even though we didn't write these account cards yet, I'll just say account cards here so we can actually see where they're going to appear. So now that we have our modal components written, looking good, we'll hop back into this top section and figure out how to actually open this modal. So what I'm going to do is first import it, and I'm going to import the account modal from apps, speed test, modals, account modal. And another thing that I want to do is I want to import a custom hook that we have called use toggle, and that is from system hooks. And all this hook is going to do, as you're going to see in a second, actually it's probably easier if I just write it. So let me go ahead and create a const, and this is going to be equal to use toggle, and I'm going to initialize it to false. So all this hook is going to do is you're going to initialize it to a value, and then whenever you call the calling function on it, it's going to switch the value. So if it's false, it's going to turn it to true, true, then you turn it to false. And yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory by the name. But for the variable that's going to store the value, I will say account modal is open. And for the function to toggle it, we'll just say toggle account modal. So now what I want to do is I want to create another render function right here. I'll say render account modal. And for this logic, I will say if the account modal is not open, then this function is just going to return null. However, if it is open, oops, I accidentally cut that instead of copied it. Now, if it is open, then what we're going to do is we're just going to return that account modal. And we also passed in this close function. And this close function is just going to be this toggle function right here. So for rendering this account modal, we are actually going to render it as a sibling to this container. So in order to do that, let me go ahead and create a fragment. And of course, we are always going to render this container, which is those top card elements. And now under here, we will say render account modal, and this will render, again, like we see right here, the account modal if this variable is true. Otherwise, by default, it's false. That means not rendered. And now as the last step, I believe the only other thing that we need to do is we need to add that on-click handler to this button element. So, all right, on-click toggle account modal. All right, so let me go ahead and I might have to restart. Yeah. Sometimes if you write too many components or make too many changes, then you actually have to restart. Hot reload won't work. All right, so check it out. So we have our button, and now when we click our button, we can see that our modal appears. And if everything worked correctly, we can close this modal either by clicking on this X icon or clicking anywhere on the overlay. And all right, looks like everything is working correctly right now. So again, just to do a quick mini recap, whenever we are deciding what to render for this account element right here, we're gonna say, well, first of all, it's this function right here, render account content. And we're gonna say if you don't have any active account number, then go ahead and render this button. And since we don't, that's why we render the button right there. The button has an on-click handler to set this value right here. Account modal is open, so it's going to turn false to true. And then since this account modal is now true, instead of null, which is this state right here, it's going to be equal to true, and therefore render this account modal. Now to close that account modal, again, all we need to do is we need to change this state from true to false. So for that function, we're just going to pass it through to the account modal, and then the account modal is going to pass it through to this modal right here, and it's going to be passed through as this close prop. And again, that's going to be on both the overlay and also on that icon. So you have two different ways to close the modal. So yeah, I think that's pretty good for now. And for this network modal, it's pretty much going to follow the same exact pattern. However, before I get started on the network modal, what I want to do is kind of just finish up all of this account logic, including these account select cards and actually updating Redux whenever we select one. And then once I have all of this working up and running, the network modal and all the related components are going to be a piece of cake. But for this video, that's probably good, getting a little long. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see y'all next time.